Hello, welcome to Skull RPG Podcast. My name's Dwight Skull.
My name's Jacob Skull.
And today we're going to teach you how to tell your story.
So, Dwight, how would you incorporate Gothic Horror into a tabletop RPG?
Nice. So, Gothic Horror, the easiest way to describe Gothic Horror is kind of like vampires, like the old school Dracula and that sort of thing.
Vampires, Frankenstein, things like that.
Yeah.
It's kind of Gothic.
Yeah, the old like turn of the century horror. So obviously there was a notable game. I never played it myself, but Ravenloft. Looks like they've made modules for 5. It came out in 2, and they made modules for 3, 5, and now they're making 5e modules as well for Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah.
And one of the things I really liked about that, and I think it was in the 3.5 supplements, they had this concept of basically these are like demi-planes of existence that were calling toward evil characters. And so even good characters locked in that plane or stuck in that plane would have to roll some sort of corruption save.
They would slowly get corrupted to evil over time just because of it's really hard for you to be good when everything around you is evil.
Yeah, and I like that concept, especially for a Gothic horror campaign, is, you know, maybe you just start out and say, okay, everybody's going to play good because you're going to need to. Because over time you're going to get corrupted. Now this is kind of how D&D handled the Call of Cthulhu, everyone goes insane. Because it's really interesting to level characters up and give them more power, but you're still having to somehow diminish them. And so in Ravenloft, the concept, or at least in a Ravenloft-like game, I guess, the concept could be that over time everybody there gets corrupted, and the more and more corrupted you get, and you can even come up with corruption points, you know, and the more and more corrupted you get, the more and more maybe the ruler of that plane can now affect your decisions, you know, which is kind of a horror aspect as well, because you're not fully in control of your character
anymore.
Right, so if you wanted to, I don't know, you know, save the child or save the village, and I look at your corruption points, and I'm like, well, make a corruption roll. You know, maybe it's like if you hit 100 corruption points, you're 100% corrupted. There's nothing you can do. So it becomes like a D100 roll real quick.
Yeah.
So you have 13 corruption points. That's fine. Just roll. Don't roll a 0 to 1 to 13, and you'll be fine. But if you did roll that, then you're no longer in control of your actions, and you're going to now go help the things that are doing the actions that you wanted to stop a second ago. And then if you paired that with the whole vampires, undead section of the any of the games that we've ever played have some sort of that sort of thing, those sort of monsters lying about. If you paired it with those kind of Gothic horror monsters, and you created a kind of a head vampire or a head decision-making league, in a lot of ways, like turning our attention to, in a lot of ways, Vampire the Masquerade is modern-day Gothic horror.
It is.
I mean, you have 12-ish, let's just say. I know there's it just depends on how you slice the pie and to what year, but you have 12-ish clans. The clans are broken into kind of 3 major factions. The one that are trying to blend in with humanity so that you don't get another crusade. Not really crusade, what was that? The Inquisition. And a Salem witch trial thing happening again. You have the other group that basically feels like they should just own mortals as cattle.
Yep.
And then you have the third group that's kind of like, I just want to be left alone by these other 2 fools, and we'll just do what we want.
I just want to live my life.
Or my unlife, I guess. But in all of that, you have political intrigue, you have mystery, you have vampires running political organizations inside of cities.
Yep.
And older vampires running potentially even entire countries, and having influence over humans in these whole things. And so if you're navigating that world as a vampire, it's less horrific than if you're navigating that world as a human, for instance. And the World of Darkness books, which is the publisher of Vampire the Masquerade, has all sorts of books where you can really run through that game any way you like. The less like a vampire you are, the more easily you are able to get killed, unless you're like a werewolf or something, like a demon. But if you're human in any way, shape, or form, it's really hard to keep alive.
Unless you're a mage, but yes.
Even mages. I mean, that game we were running, I had to scale back all the monsters. But regardless,
Uh huh.
um, regardless, the nice thing about that is if you wanted to run an easy and quick modern Gothic horror, I would suggest just doing a Vampire the Masquerade game. Um, or if you're not familiar with those at all, I really would suggest, which was been called the most broken best video game of the year when it way came out, but you can get it on GOG.com for pretty cheap. You can get Vampire the Masquerade
Bloodlines.
Bloodlines, which is the second of the game, so you want that one. It really does a good job telling you the story and getting you familiar. But regardless, going back to kind of a D&D game, I would play it with some sort of big bad who has some huge supernatural powers,
Mm-hmm.
and then a lot of levels of something like a vampire added to that character, or a werewolf or something like that. Some sort of monster.
Supernatural, something monstrous.
Exactly. And then I'd make sure that I'd get him at level enough that he or she can do dominate,
Mm-hmm.
so that you can kind of create that network that's needed for that. And then I would start creating levels of, like, at that point you start figuring out, like, what's the end goal? Is the end goal to kill this person, or is the end goal something a lot less audacious, right? If the end goal is to kill that person, which probably would be in a D&D game, then I would start looking at what layers and factions live underneath that person, and then I start
Mm-hmm.
building it out like I think about a video game at that point, where you start out in one little backwards part, you got to kill the local county version of that, then
Break
you move
free.
up to the next one, and you kind of have to, like, as you level up, you're killing the smaller beasties that are controlled in some way, shape, or form, willingly
Mm-hmm.
or unwillingly, by this big bad, until finally they get into what I would call the third act of your campaign, where now they're able to finally kind of do the last steps and go fight that person. Now, because it's Gothic horror, I would have a huge twist where I wouldn't necessarily make it so that, I mean, I would probably put that guy 4 or 5, maybe 6 levels above the party. At 6 levels above, you're almost guaranteeing a total party kill.
Mm-hmm.
And then I would just let the dice fall where they may and see what happens. Because, again, Gothic horror typically, I mean, it can kind of end well. But even if you look, okay, here's spoilers for Bram Stoker's Dracula. And no offense, it's been out for 100 years, so this is on you. Um, Dracula is said by Van Helsing that he can only be killed with a stake in his heart, and then his head has to be cut off. Yeah, and they do that with the lesser vampires. But yet, when you hear the recounting of the tale after Van Helsing and
Van Helsing just shoots Dracula in square in the chest and just walks away, and Dracula's dead somehow.
right, it doesn't make any sense. What makes sense is the two people that went. There's like 3 guys that went in. One gets killed almost immediately, and the other 2 kind of come out alive, and they tell you, oh yeah, Dracula's dead. But when the details are asked about it, Dracula gets shot, and then they just walk out of there. Which, to me, because Dracula had been shot earlier in the book, and he was, no offense, he was better than fine.
Mm-hmm.
It did nothing.
Didn't even phase him.
So now you have what I would consider Dracula gets cornered. He kills one. He dominates the other 2,
Mm-hmm.
and then tells them to tell the rest of the group, "Hey, I'm dead. Everything's cool." So what I really like about the book Dracula is, if you do a careful reading of Dracula, Dracula 1, he's still around, and now he has minions with 2 kind of high powered people,
Mm-hmm. He's just laying dormant and pulling strings now.
which is what he's done for hundreds of years. So what's another, like, let's just let Jonathan Harker get old
Yeah.
and we'll just leave it alone. Well, of course, the problem is, maybe the book helped. Like, so when Dracula shows up again, people know what to do. But that what I really like about the concept of Gothic horror is that Gothic horror has the element that the heroes may just all get killed, and there's nothing to do about it.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's the case, you could then open up the next line of story where, if you want to keep playing in that world, the new breed of heroes come up. And maybe they have a shot of killing, because all of the guys are now less, right? Like the first group that went in has killed all of the people that, again, it takes time to get experience. So they've killed all of the old captains of the guard that have maybe been around for a couple hundred years with that vampire. And, now he's got to rely on people that have only maybe been around for 20 or 30 years.
Yeah.
And so it diminishes the power overall. Maybe the second time through you guys can do it. Anyway, that's how I would run Gothic Horror. The other thing I'd love to do, though, is throw on a corruption thing on top of it, and maybe every week or every kind of action that's somewhat questionable, there's some corruption rolls, and you start building up corruption points to 100, which could really make life a little easier, even if you only did make the last guy only maybe 2 or 3 levels ahead, so easily able to be killed by the party, but maybe just one person gets killed. Well, if the entire party's walking in with 50 to 60 corruption points, as a free action, I would give my big bad the ability to literally make a command, and everybody in the room has to make a corruption roll or follow it.
Yeah.
And so if half the party turns on half the party because they don't have any choice because of the actions that they did years ago.
How many spells does a wizard have to shut down a fighter permanently?
Too many.
Uh-huh.
Right. And so that's what I would do with Gothic Horrors. I'd play around with all of those concepts and pick a couple and go with it. But I really like the corruption point system, frankly.
Mm-hmm. Hey, thanks for listening.
And for more resources, please go to skullrpg.com.